Hello, my name is Father Timothy Tighe, and this is our 171st segment of our journey of faith in the light of the cross, and I thank you so much for journeying with us. We look up on our screen and we see the theme for 171. Why did the exiles who returned to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple turn out to be so different than the Israelis who remained in Babylonian exile? We go on to our next screen. Hebrews gives us the answer in 11:9-16. For most converts in the first century were also exiles. We read verse 9. By faith Abraham sojourned in the promised land as if in a foreign country, dwelling in tents, and I put tab with tabernacles, is the same word for tents, in tents or tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob. He was looking for a city whose architect and maker is God. All these died in faith. They did not receive the promise, but greeted it from afar, for they accepted themselves as strangers and aliens on earth. For they desired a better homeland, a heavenly one. Now we go to our next screen. The Babylonian exiles remaining in Babylon accepted Deuteronomy 12, which says, God will choose one place as his abode. And David, later on, revealed that abode as Jerusalem, and there alone was animal sacrifice allowed on the spot where Solomon's temple was. But the fathers of the exiles told them how the Zadokite priest had corrupted Solomon's temple and caused its destruction. The exiles also read the prophets who condemned the abuses of animal sacrifice by Zadokite priest before the destruction of the temple. Now Zadok was David's high priest, and only Zadok's seed could be high priest. That is, the word Zadokite evolved into Sadducee. Okay, we go on to the next screen. The exiles also believed that God creates in orderly ways, and they had to be well educated to zealously search Torah in Hebrew to reveal God's justice to the world by heroically living God's commands. But the exiles also had learned from the prophets that Yahweh did not need a land or an earthly abode, for he was the universal God who could redeem the work of disordered goyim like the Persians. So we go on this mystery. He has an abode in Jerusalem, but why is he also the universal God? How do you reconcile the two? We have to look forward to that. In faith, they could accept life as strangers and aliens in Babylon, in a disordered goy land, as Abraham and Moses did, for they were prospering in Babylon. Okay, so they stayed in Babylon. We go on to our next screen. But those returning to Jerusalem wanted to control their lives, and they no longer wanted to feel like strangers and aliens. Thus the returnees did not feel called to sojourn and tent or tabernacle in the spirit of Abraham and Moses. Most returnees in 538 were born in exile, therefore they didn't see Solomon's temple. And they imagined building an iconic temple which would prosper like Solomon's temple, which was destroyed 50 years before in 587, but which they were told about. But reality smashed the fantasies of the returnees. They found it too hard to build a temple. We go on to our next screen. The last of the prophets came challenging and consoling, but personal holiness was needed, which was more the work of the priest than the prophets. Each returnee had to repent of his smallness and live more heroically as a bigger person. We've been mentioning that repent means unbind yourself and let God grow you into a bigger mind, a more magnanimous person. The shock of total failure in Jerusalem trying to rebuild the temple led to much rethinking of Israel's teaching on holiness. The priest re-edited the original 4 books of Moses from the E and J traditions. They did not re-edit Deuteronomy. This final re-editing took place in Babylon after 516, so we're really moving along in the years here. We go on to our next screen. In 520, Zarah Babel, the legal descendant of David's line, came to help and be king. But the Persians did not support building a wall around this new city kingdom, for it could use to rebel against the Persians. Their new neighbors resented their attitude and easily harassed their building of a new temple because there was no wall to protect them. The prophet Haggai scolded the returnees for not rebuilding the temple. He demanded they purify the land with a temple. Made to feel ashamed, the returnees lost their fervent attitude and blamed each other. But they did finish building a pitiful little temple in 516 BC. We go on to our next screen. Ezra, the high priest, was the supervisor of this last re-edition of the Pentateuch or Torah. That's the same thing, the first 5 books of the Bible. Thus, Ezra is called the founder of modern Judaism. And they use the word Judaism, which is strange after the last segment. He was sent in 458 to revive Jerusalem and whip the people into shape. That is 150 years later. He had Torah read out loud to all the people, but he had trouble enforcing it. Now, Nehemiah was a high-ranking minister for the Persian king, and probably a eunuch. When he heard of Jerusalem's plight, he had the king send him to Jerusalem to help. He rallied the people to build a wall in 52 days before the neighbors could gather to stop him. And so this made a big difference. We go on to our next screen. Ezra and Nehemiah were both super achievers. And this is interesting how the super achievers were identified with the eunuchs, who got things done by doing what was necessary without their minds confused with sexual thoughts. Both looked down at the people and decided to reduce the chosen to an elite remnant willing to separate from anyone who held them down, who held Judah down. Scholars write that only 15 to 25% of Judah went into exile in Babylon. So 75 to 85% of Judeans stayed on the land. Ezra and Nehemiah demanded the talented 20th percent to separate from the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. But many of the 80% saw themselves as Judeans, but they were shamed, rejected, and abandoned as mixed-blood illiterates. We go on to our next screen. Scholars say only 25% of Galileans and Judeans in Jesus' time were accepted in synagogue. The rest were called the Great Unwashed, for they smelled. The elites had shamefully accepted Herod's temple, for the magnificent building and animal sacrifice brought great prosperity to both Sadducees and Pharisees. But John the Baptist rejected the temple of Herod and served the Am Haaretz. By this, he was enlightened by God's grace to recognize Jesus as God's anointed. The Sadducees shamed, rejected, and abandoned Jesus on the cross, and thus put an end to animal sacrifice. We go to our next screen. This elite attitude poisoned Jerusalem's air. Toxic zealots incited riots with Palestinians who Nero favored. Remember, Claudius favored the Jews, but now Nero irritated them terrible. This toxic thinking incited rebellion against Rome. And now we have the final verses. Hebrews was written from Alexandria to snobbish synagogue of Hebrews in Rome by Apollo, who thought they were Christians, but they wanted to use Hebrew. Hebrews 11:16, God is not ashamed to be called the God of those seeking a heavenly homeland. Seek peace and holiness. May no one lack God's grace, so no bitter feelings rise up. And we go to our next screen. Why did the exiles who returned to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple turn out to be so different than the Israelis who remained in exile? I hope you are learning something from this. Thank you for joining us, and thank you so much for continuing our journey in the light of the cross.